one of those things.
Can you hear us now?
I mean, not now they can hear, but through the laptop only. Echo? Yeah.
Well, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Someone.
We're gonna. I'm not seeing the mic. Oh, that's not gonna
That's the
work.
mic, yeah.
Maybe just think here and speak. Okay. All right. Wonderful. Okay, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to be an echo. You can hear that. Yeah, there it is.
Oh.
Let's turn it on now. See.
Okay. Right. A little bit of an.
Wow. Good.
Thank you. Hi.
Good move. Problems that
We usually have to do it helps.
Okay. I joined this. We want to start here.
So you join here.
We can exit this and join from here. Yeah, we can leave. Okay. I'm not here. But it's scheduled, but
What's the meeting on? Here we go. 971 0401 4880.
yeah. Issues not when we. But
That's fine.
oh,
Okay, we mute
it's
here.
just- no, we-
Can you guys hear
Dear online folks.
us? Can you? Okay. We hear you, but okay. So this is better.
I wonder if this is what's.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you need to? Okay. Well, okay. Do you want to do? Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rowan Arar, and I am here to introduce Rebecca Tesfaye, our speaker for today. I'll be speaking really loud into this computer since we had some mic issues. I suppose I just want to quickly mention that after the talk, we're going to have a lunch and a meeting with graduate students after Rebecca's talk. And I'll quickly read her bio as so not to take too much time. Professor Rebecca Tesfaye is an associate professor of sociology at Temple University. Her research provides a comprehensive account of Black immigrants' economic, political, and residential incorporation over time and across place. As a social demographer, she uses these analyses to re-examine our theoretical understanding of both immigrant incorporation and racial stratification. Her work has been published in Race and Ethnicity, Urban and Immigration journals, including International Migration Review, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, and the Journal of Refugee Studies. So please join me in welcoming Professor Tesfaye to present her work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Also speak loud and into this computer. Okay, so today I'm presenting work that was published in Journal of Refugee Studies, looking at long-term economic outcomes of refugees who entered the US during the 1980s. Okay. So the original mission of the United States was to provide asylum to the oppressed. I just walked away. But for most of our history, we didn't have a consistent or comprehensive process for selecting, admitting, or resettling refugees in the US. Our first refugee legislation focused on resettling refugees after World War II. And after the war, refugees were primarily defined based on people fleeing communism. The Refugee Act of 1980 was meant to change all of that by making a systematic resettlement process and creating a new definition of refugees. So the legislation made the US definition more in line with international standards, but it does specify that we admit refugees based on special humanitarian concern to the United States. And that is a phrase that was not defined in the legislation. So it can mean a lot of things. And it takes a little bit of work to figure out who is of special humanitarian concern. So the way that I've looked at it is comparing worldwide refugee population data to our refugee ceilings. And these two figures focus on the 1980s. And on the top, it shows regional distribution of the worldwide refugee population. And you can see that the majority of refugees were Asian, who are in the dark purple, and yellow, which are sub-Saharan African. So if our refugee admissions were solely based on need, then the bottom figure, which is the refugee, the top one, but it doesn't. Despite the high level of need. Africans were actually the smallest regional group represented in our admissions patterns, and that sort of indicated that there's very little humanitarian concern for this particular group. The US position on refugee resettlement was illustrated quite clearly by the US Coordinator for Refugee Affairs in 1979, when he said that even though the majority of refugees in the world come from Africa, we don't have to resettle those refugees, some other countries do. And that kind of rhetoric received some national attention, which you can see in the quote on the left-hand side, which quotes both Jesse Jackson and Shirley Chisholm. So Jesse Jackson said that race is perhaps the most critical factor in immigration policy, and Shirley Chisholm talked specifically saying that refugees of color were not a priority to the United States. But the US on African refugees more broadly, like politically, didn't actually change. And congressional refugee consultations very consistently throughout the 1980s gave the same reasons for that. So I have a little section from 1985 there that's representative of basically the whole decade, saying that because African countries are so hospitable, then we don't actually have to resettle Africans because neighboring countries can do that. Now, even if that was true, which is debatable, it doesn't explain why the government said it was focusing on resettling professionals, skilled workers, and students from urban backgrounds. So they're essentially selecting African refugees during this period based on skill, and they didn't do that for any other group. In theory, African refugees' high level of skill should lead to greater success in the labor market than other refugees, but it's not necessarily clear that that would be the case. Oops, sorry, went too far. In part because of a requirement that they take the first job that they're offered. So they need to find employment very quickly, because that if they don't, they will not be eligible for cash assistance. So refugees are employed at very high rates, but researchers find that they earn low wages because they're sort of pushed into the labor market really early. Among refugees, Europeans do earn higher wages than those from sub-Saharan Africa, but this is focusing on the first 5 years in the country. So because refugee data sets only follow refugees for their first 5 years in the US, there's a lot of research on early outcomes, and they find positive employment characteristics, but low wages. But there are very few studies of long-term economic outcomes. And in addition, there, to my knowledge, were no studies of racial differences in long-term economic patterns or market outcomes. Okay. So what I did in the paper, what I'm going to submit to here, is work that asked basically 3 questions. So first off, do refugees achieve long-term economic success in the US? Second, how do their labor market outcomes compare to the US-born and non-refugee immigrants of the same race? And did the skill selection for African refugees lead to more positive labor market outcomes relative to other groups? Because that seemed to be the motivation behind that kind of selection. Refugees point to a number of determinants of labor market success. Some of them are true of all foreign-born, some of them are refugee-specific. So what I'm going to do is first sort of quickly go over the theories that describe immigrants' experiences in the labor market, and then I'll go into refugee-specific theories. So the most common theories for immigrants more broadly: human capital, imperfect transferability, and Q theories. Human capital theory basically says that any variation in economic outcomes can be attributed to differences in education and skill. And because many immigrants or foreign-born more broadly may lack human capital that's valued in their host country labor market, you expect their earnings to be lower than the native-born. But if you control for all of that, then there wouldn't be a difference. But that is not sufficient, because when we control for human capital, we still find economic differences between groups. So Black immigrants generally are higher educated than most of other immigrant groups. And when you control for their educational attainment and other characteristics, they earn significantly less than the US-born. When you look at refugees, the educational attainment of refugees admitted in the 80s was quite low, because the majority were Southeast Asians and they had lower educational attainment. But Africans who were the smallest refugee group were selected by skill, as I said. And at that time, the majority of African refugees were East African. So there is some research looking at East Africans entering in the labor market, and despite high levels of human capital, they still earn, or they enter the US labor market as low wage workers. So the labor market disadvantage that we see, even after we control for human capital, may be because they have foreign degrees or work experience. And imperfect transferability theory says that, well, maybe they're just negatively affected by foreign credentials. And part of that has to do with the fact that we don't have a system for employers to use to validate what those credentials mean. Like, you don't know what a degree from Nigeria means versus one from Ethiopia versus one from France. And so because they don't have enough information, they will essentially sort of underutilize those skills. And that will happen more often if employers have a negative attitude towards the foreign-born. Foreign credentials may be a larger barrier for refugees compared to immigrants because of their admissions process. So there can be decades between the time they apply to be a refugee and the time that they enter the United States. And they can undergo skill depreciation and occupational deprivation during that time. And when they get to the US, they can often experience unemployment and occupational downgrading as a result of that time. Now, even accounting for foreign education, researchers still find racial differences in labor market outcomes, which point to queuing theory as an explanation for these disparities. Employers' evaluation of applicants' race and nativity plays a large role in their placement in the applicant queue. So essentially, this is discrimination with a rank order. Because of the combination of their race and nativity, foreign-born Black individuals are expected to experience the most disadvantage in the labor market, and we do see that in the research. And as in the larger foreign-born population, we see discrimination playing a consistent role in refugees' short-term labor market outcomes. Vietnamese refugees in Oakland and Philadelphia complained of blocked mobility, and employer discrimination was the most common barrier for African and Asian refugee employment. Okay, so that was for immigrants broadly, but refugees have a very different entry process. So there's a few different theories that are domains of refugee integration that matter for refugees specifically, and those are discourse, initiatives and support, relations between federal and local governments, and location. In the US, discourse focusing on limiting refugees was and still is very common. If you look at public opinion polls over the last 80 years, we consistently oppose admitting large numbers of refugees into the United States. And that opinion was held by many people that were working in the US government. So the top quote comes from a magazine interview of a member of President Reagan's Foreign Policy Advisory Board. And in that interview, she spoke at length about the changing face of immigrants and refugees. And in this quote, she describes how she would feel more compassion for her injured pet bird than she would for starving people in sub-Saharan Africa. Legislators, including Alan K. Simpson, who was chair, I believe, chair of the subcommittee on immigration and refugee policy, echoed those kinds of statements, but more diplomatically, by saying that the influx of refugees was out of control, and that would have profound implications on the US because they were coming from different regions of the world. So overall, he felt that we could fix that by limiting the number of refugees and where. So as you might expect, that discourse meant different admissions patterns for different refugee groups. Eastern European refugees were long considered of special humanitarian concern, so they had high admissions, as did Southeast Asians during this time period. But as stated in the quote on the bottom right, African refugees were never admitted in proportion to their population. That was really in the 1980s when we're talking about groups coming from communist countries. So Ethiopia was, well, whether you call it communist or socialist, that depends, but affiliated with the Soviet Union, but they were not getting the same kinds of admissions as Southeast Asians or Eastern Europeans. Not only did popular and political discourse affect admissions, but it also played a role in the initiatives and support that were available to refugees. Subcommittee discussions prior to passing the Refugee Act really revolved around fears of resettlement costs and the insistence that refugees become economically self-sufficient really quickly. So because of that, refugees are the only group that are required to become economically self-sufficient within a particular time frame. And because there were continued worries about costs, the amount of time that refugees were eligible for benefits has changed over time. So when the Refugee Act was passed, refugees were eligible for a maximum of 36 months of cash assistance, whether it was federally provided or federally reimbursed. But that declined after 1986, and it just sort of gradually went down until 91, when assistance was limited to 8 months, and it stayed at that level since then. The thought process behind this was, if we limit the cash assistance, then that means they will get into the labor market more quickly and become self-sufficient really quickly. And to help in that process, the US government works in partnership with private voluntary agencies to resettle refugees and help them find work, which is good, but because there's limited funding for this process, caseworkers are motivated to get them into work quickly with partner institutions, which means low wage work that they may be overqualified for. And because refugees often work long-term for their initial employers, that can have really long-standing effects on their economic outcomes. Another unique aspect of refugees' experiences in the US is that they're the only foreign-born group that doesn't choose their initial place of resettlement. Early in the program, refugees were just generally placed where there were large co-ethnic communities, and then the federal government would reimburse localities for the cost of resettlement. And the federal government thought that they were quite generous with their reimbursement, but localities did not agree with that. And you can see that in the quote on the bottom that came from the chair of the National Association of Counties, basically saying that they weren't reimbursing enough and they were not taking local level factors into consideration. So for example, they weren't thinking about the availability of low cost housing in those places. So it was hard to find refugees housing. In response to that, the federal government worked to, they still will make placement decisions based on where a refugee has family or where there's a co-ethnic community. And because of that, white, Black, and Asian refugees have very different settlement patterns. But now about a third are free cases, and those refugees are settled across the country in places based on local conditions. And where refugees are placed is important because of the social and economic context in those places. So if you're in a co-ethnic community, you'll have networks that may be helpful to finding you a job or a place to live. Some states have more generous assistance programs, so economically it matters where you're put. To give you an idea of where refugees lived, these are the top 5 settlement areas for white, Black, and Asian refugee groups in 1990 and 2019. This is the percent of the refugee population that total that lives in these places, not the percent of that place that's made up of refugees, just to be clear. So if you're looking at Asian refugees in 1990, you can see that every one of their major settlement areas were in California. And that changed over time a little bit, but still the largest population for California. Black refugees, 3 of their most common were in California in 1990, but their distribution changed over time. So in 2019, their settlement patterns actually mirrored that of Black immigrants more broadly. White refugees or European refugees were much more distributed across the country. Asian refugees in California may have been beneficial to them because California has more generous assistance programs, and that is particularly important for refugees entering in the 1980s because of the economic condition at that time. It was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and 90% of job loss happened in the goods producing sector, and that's the sector that the refugees were most likely to work in. The reason I'm sort of pushing on this is because if you enter the labor market during a bad economy, that can lead to negative repercussions well after your initial few years in the United States or initial few years in the labor market for anybody, especially for people with a college education. And the economic conditions in the 80s may have led to differential outcomes within refugees because of the unemployment rates at that time. So unemployment was high for everybody, but during this period, Black joblessness was highest. So in the last quarter of 1982, 20% of Black Americans were unemployed as compared to 9% of white adults. So you might see very different patterns for refugees based on these kinds of larger issues that were happening. So together, the evidence suggests that because there are requirements for working, refugees are more likely or are very likely to be working, and they'll continue that decades after arrival, no matter what. Now, some initial jobs are often low skilled, so I expect refugees to be more likely to experience poverty and use welfare than other immigrants in the US born. And because of racial discrimination in the labor market, I expected African refugees to earn lower wages than other groups. So I used a lot of data here. So what I did is I used the 1990 and 2000 5% samples of the US Census and the 2006 to 2010 and 2015 to 2019 American Community Surveys. And I combined that with data from the 82 to 87 Yearbook of Immigration Statistics. I'm going to talk a little bit about it on the next slide, but I combined those because there's no information about visa status or entry visa in the census, so you need to sort of estimate that. I limited the sample to working adults, and because the identified refugees were all sub-Saharan African, European, Southeast Asian, it's all non-Hispanic, Black, white, and Asian individuals. Immigrants and refugees are limited to those entering between 1982 and 87. And I did that because that's the group of refugees with the most access to cash assistance, the longest access. So I wanted to eliminate the possibility that variation that I saw amongst refugees was because they had different access to benefits. And so since I did that for refugees, I also did that for immigrants as well. Okay. I have 4 dependent variables, and I use 2 different methods to look at that. So I use logistic regression to determine likelihood of living in poverty and receiving welfare income. And then I use the Heckman selection model to first determine probability of full-time employment, and then look at wages after controlling for selection into full-time employment. The main independent variable is refugee status, and because the census does not ask for visa entry, I'm using country of birth and year of entry pairings to identify these. So I get the number from the then the number of refugee arrivals from a specific country in a specific year comes from the Yearbook of Immigration Statistics. And then I basically like put those into that refugee concentration ratio. So the number of refugees is in the numerator, number of immigrants is not. And any country or any country year pair with a ratio of 0.7 or more, I consider a refugee. Obviously not a perfect estimate. I'm going to, I mean, to me, yes, there's imperfections in it. I kind of like it because I'm underestimating the effect of refugee status. Like this is better than you might expect because I have some immigrants listed in there. Also, I checked what I got from this concentration ratio against the Yearbook of Immigration Statistics, and the people I identified or the countries I identified were the countries with refugees coming in this yearbook. So it worked out. Yeah, we can talk about it more though. Okay. In addition to refugee status, few different variables, a lot of variables in the analyses. Specifically, I'll talk about the ones who test the different theories. Control for human capital using educational attainment and English ability. Imperfect transferability, I use estimated foreign education. And for economic conditions when entering the workforce, I use an estimate of, well, I use the national employment rate when people were estimated to enter the US workforce. So I did this for everybody. So it's not just the foreign born and when they. Oh, no? Yes, okay. To give you an idea of the characteristics, this table shows you some. Throughout this, I'm just going to focus on the first and last periods because otherwise it gets to be a lot of numbers. Yes, so what you can see here is that if you look at the top half, which is 1990, except for Asian refugees, both refugee and non-refugees immigrants were highly educated. About 25% of, well, about a quarter of African refugees and 40% of African and Asian non-refugees had at least a college degree. Even though they were more highly educated and more likely to work full-time than US-born white and Black individuals, African immigrant and refugee wages were lower than any group except Asian refugees. By 2019, college completion rates increased for everybody, as did full-time employment and wages, but refugees experienced a smaller increase in constant wages when you compare them to their same race immigrant counterparts. The next few slides focus on national level regressions. I also have regressions focusing on major settlement areas. Right? I've put those to the very end because I was worried about time. If you want to talk about those, I can. I have them, but yeah, they're not here yet. Okay, all graphs have the same structure, so I'm going to go over the structure first. Black individuals are always in yellow, Asian individuals are in purple, and white or European are in green. Striped US-born, olive or immigrants, dotted are refugees. So left-hand side, and the left-hand side is US-born, far right is refugees in every one of these. So this slide focuses on probability of living. In 1990, immigrants and refugees were between 2 and 4 times more likely than the US-born or US-born white adults to live in poverty after controlling for all independent variables. Odds ratios did decline over time. By 2019, you can see that most groups have similar poverty rates to US-born whites. The only groups with significantly higher poverty rates were US-born Black adults and European immigrants. You might assume that poverty rates and rates of receiving welfare income might mirror each other. And for US-born Black adults, they do. So if in 1990, they were 2.2 times more likely to live in poverty. In 1990, they were almost twice as likely than US-born white adults to receive welfare income, but nobody else has that kind of consistent pattern. I find that refugees in 1990 were more likely than immigrants to receive welfare income, but still everybody was less likely than US-born white adults to receive welfare income. That went up a little bit between 1990 and 2000, and then went down after that, possibly due to the 1996 welfare reform that time-limited welfare for everybody and reduced access for the foreign-born generally. By 2019, you can see that no foreign-born group is significantly more likely than US-born white adults to receive welfare income. And this was actually kind of important because that was something that they talked a lot about in those congressional consultations when discussing admitting refugees, because they didn't want a welfare-dependent population, and that is clearly not what they got, right? Now, likelihood of living in poverty and receiving welfare are indicators of economic conditions, but not necessarily. So this slide and the next one are looking at full-time employment and wages. So this is full-time employment, and I find that likely due to the 1980s recession, nearly everybody was significantly less likely to be employed full-time than US-born white adults, and they had the lowest coefficients than any other year. And one thing that we do notice though is that refugees were more likely to work full-time, or sorry, I should say white and Black refugees were more likely than white and Black immigrants to work full-time in 1990. So they were still a little bit more in the workforce at that time. Full-time employment rates increased over time for everybody. And by 2019, all non-white immigrants were significantly more likely than US-born white adults to work full-time. African refugees actually have the highest full-time employment rate of any group. Oh, I will also say likelihood of full-time employment was an analysis including all working age adults who were in the labor force. Then that gives you an idea of labor market experience, but I wanted to look at wages and compare people with similar work conditions, right? Because likely, well, if you work full-time versus part-time, wages even for the same job are higher. So I wanted to focus specifically on full-time employees. And this is showing in 1990, the largest negative relative wage coefficients are happening for Black workers, regardless of nativity status. So in every group, the yellow bars have the largest negative coefficients, saying that they have the largest wage disadvantage. Specifically, African immigrants earn 40% lower wages and African refugees 30% lower than US born whites in 1990. In 2019, so this is 40 years after arrival because it's still the 82 to 87 cohort, African immigrants and refugees still earn significantly less than US born whites, and they're the only group for which that's true. So it's US born and all foreign born Black adults earn less. Okay. So what does all of it mean? I find that even though refugees do, this is not necessarily the same as economic, right? There's variation in outcomes, and in many cases, refugees are still very disadvantaged relative both to the US born and even immigrants of the same background. And so this really indicates a process of survival employment, because refugees are just as likely to work full-time, but are disadvantaged in terms of wages, leaving them self-sufficient, but not successful. In comparison to non-refugees, there were different patterns depending on racial background. White refugees' labor market experiences just become more like their non-refugee counterparts when you're looking at full-time employment and wages. But for Black and Asian refugees, that only happens when it comes to wages. If you're comparing to the US born, by 2019, Asian refugees have similar outcomes in terms of welfare and full-time employment. Black refugees have more positive labor market outcomes in terms of welfare and full-time employment, but wages are quite similar across the board. Which way did I go? Yeah, there we are. So given US born Black wage disadvantage, having a similar outcome despite having high levels of skill. So these outcomes really have to be great and in the US. African refugees have lower and all foreign born in all periods. In all four, which is some surprise because how it's higher and even individual. I didn't present the results here, but I present them. So there are African refugee methods, but the significantly lower wages are largely reflected in that. Maybe do not wear use of stereotypes during hiring, and we're making phrases. There's some research showing that stereotypes negative about the minority. So that would leave Black men labor market. So overall, what we're seeing is pattern of self-sufficiency, but not for Black refugees, with Black male workers broadly. So I did want to talk a little bit about policy because there's a lot of policy. And again, I focused on the 82 to 87 cohort because they were eligible for more cash assistance than any other group. So this is a cohort that came in when not only was there more cash assistance, but there was priority for English language courses and job training so that they would be more prepared for the US labor market. So because they had more time to prepare, they are the refugees that were best placed for long-term economic success. So these results probably show the best case scenario for long-term economic outcomes among refugees. And I mean, refugee policy at the time was useful in some ways because it did work out in terms of getting people into the labor market. But that skill selection that they used for African refugees did not lead to any kind of wage outcomes, positive wage outcomes. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because refugee policy doesn't really address racial disadvantages or racial experiences of discrimination in the labor market. So one thing that would be very helpful in this is to have policy standardizing the use of anonymous applications, or to reduce the amount of unnecessary information that employers get in the application process, to help at least get rid of that racial or ethnic screening that happens. And so generally, like, if we made it a bit more fair for everybody, not just refugees, then refugees would also do a little bit better in the labor market. Okay, thank you. They are not included in my slide. Not at all. No. It's true. Like, at the time that I was looking at this work, I think the only people that would have counted as refugees at that time, or with a large enough proportion, were people from Afghanistan. And since it didn't sort of go with anything I was doing, I left them out. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the question was if there's any Afro-Latinos in the data set. So no, everybody's non-Hispanic in this data set, in part because there's actually a really small number of Hispanic refugees at that time, or people from Latin America at that time. So everybody's non-Hispanic here. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah, no, that's the wrong way. Yes. Okay, yes. So the question is, why do I think if we're not full-time employed, we're not receiving welfare? So there's a couple of things. The refugee population, I'm not sure if that put into the welfare category. So I'm unclear about like how that. But also you're right. I think from what I've read so far, I think that there's always a bit of confusion or not an understanding of how you apply. And so they're less likely to take advantage of benefits that they are. Yeah. So what I did is I didn't care about the age that they were when they entered. So it's 25 to 65 in all 4 periods. And when you look at white refugees, that their age changed quite a bit. So you're looking at people who entered at young ages, and like by the time you get 2019, there are people who were very young when they entered the United States. African refugees, there's not so much of an age difference over time. So it's gonna have at least some of the same people in 1990 as you do of 2019, because there wasn't that much of a change in the age range. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it would be helpful to have that information. I think immigrants would be more likely to go back than refugees, especially if you're like African refugees. It takes so long to get here that by the time you get here, you're probably not moving back. But and the difference in the selection process of entering or staying, refugees would probably be more likely to stay. That is my guess, but I don't have any information on that, to be honest with you. It would matter for this because if I think, so my thought process here is that refugees would be more likely to stay than immigrants, which means that the immigrants would be, in theory, the people who did better in the labor market here. Otherwise, they wouldn't go back. So you might see less of a difference between immigrants and refugees if I could control for out-migration patterns. Yeah. It's possible. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, because these were all national level. I can show you some of the things. So this is for looking at major settlement areas. And one thing I will say is that which it's a very busy set of graphs. I'll go to the wages one. Basically, like refugee settlement area does not seem to be that, like living in a settlement area doesn't seem to be helpful for wages. In particular, Black refugees, I believe, earn lower wages in many cases in their settlement areas than they do, for example, in white refugee settlement areas. So I think settlement area matters and social network matters, not for wages, but likely for employment, because we see kind of positive outcomes there, but we saw that at the national level as well. Yeah. I don't. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sorry. No, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I don't use anything about sector of employment here. I have done some preliminary analyses looking at occupational mismatch and its effect on wages with the same kind of group of refugees. And if I remember correctly, because they're preliminary. So Black refugees were similar to Black immigrants in terms of likelihood of mismatch. So they have large likelihoods of occupational mismatch. I think yes, they have large likelihoods of occupational mismatch. And they also have the largest wage disadvantage as a result of that occupational mismatch. Even if we're taking into account whether or not they're appropriately placed based on their human capital, you still see a disadvantage in all these spaces. Yeah. I think that when you're It would be people, and that yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is a oh yeah, this is actually not that technical, to be honest with you. So you use the population weights in the census and the ACS so that you get the actual number of people from each number of people from each country in each year who entered in each year. And so once you have that in sort of table format, and then you can also have, then you go to the yearbook of immigration statistics and you find the number of refugee arrivals each year from particular countries. You can get fancy with it. I just used Excel because it was easier for me. And then I made the ratio for each group and then inputted that into Stata. It's surprisingly straightforward, which is nice. I will say, like, it's what you end up doing is prioritizing larger refugee populations, which likely means that you are focusing on groups who had maybe the worst humanitarian conditions. So these might be the people who would have the most difficulty becoming incorporated into the United States. That is one drawback of this, because you can't look at smaller populations with it. But if you are looking at the largest populations, then you are looking at the largest groups of refugees. So pros and cons on that, but yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, when you have a Bible, this is the sort of a simple way to go about it. This is for a yes, no. So are you in poverty or not? Are you receiving more? And then I use the code and data so I can get off those, and that way it's a little bit easier to yeah. Yes. Mm. Yeah. Currently or then? Then at that time, they were really focusing on the idea that US immigration policy was kind of racist. And they were the only people who were saying that. In some cases, like in this quote, they focused on Ethiopia. That was in part because at that time, I believe they were taking, at that time they were taking away the temporary protection status for Ethiopians that were in the United States, because the leader at the time said it's safe for them to come back. And so the US said, great, you can go back. And they're saying, no, we don't do this like for Poland as an example. So why are we doing this for Ethiopians? And there was I think Shirley Chisholm was really involved in trying to make sure that didn't happen. And that ended up being overturned. And so they continued to have temporary protective status. Other than this particular moment with the temporary protection status, I think I don't know where that quote was. Here, I think this Ebony Magazine article more broadly was, even though they used the word refugees, they were talking about Haitians in a lot in this particular article. And so they were talking about asylum seekers and again, saying the same thing. Yeah. Mm. I mean, the only real thing that I think because a lot of the, not responsibility, a lot of the, I don't know, a lot of the ability to make this, like it's at an employer level, which is difficult. But if you can, like the only thing I could really think of was anonymizing the applications. At least that gets more people in the door for the interviews. I don't know what happens after the interviews. That is a separate question, but at the very least they make it through that stage, and that's at least better than they're doing. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. And in some of the research that is depending on where, like the sector, which gets to the other point that was made, like that means different things. So I remember reading some research looking at African immigrants nurses, and they said that their ethnicity was a negative for them, as opposed to Caribbean nurses where it was seemed to be a positive. So there's different experiences in how that nativity matters, depending on where you're from. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm not sure. There's more questions in the chat.